So, hello everyone, and welcome to this CCSE conversation. This is an initiative of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events of the University of the West of Scotland. The centre has developed from a collaborative partnership between UWS and Renfrewshire Council. So the CCSE provides a space to undertake collaborative research and development work that has local, national, and international relevance. And today I have the pleasure to welcome you here. We have Caro Overy, who is the Carbon Management Planning Officer, and Romane Boyer, who is Green Arts and Edinburgh Festivals Officer of Carbon Creative Scotland. So hello, Caro. Hello, Romane. And
Hello.
Thanks for joining me today. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, I think we're all right. Yeah,
Good.
not doing too badly.
A bit of a broken voice. Sorry for that.
That's okay. It's winter time, the time that we're recording this, just before Christmas. And so it's fine. The weather is changing considerably just now. So
good. Loads of honey.
Lots of honey,
honey and hot water, ginger.
Exactly. It's tea time. So thanks for joining me today. As I said, we have been developing a lot of these conversations during the pandemic time, as a way to engage with stakeholders, but also make sure that we gather information that we can share with our students at the UWS, but also with other partners. And obviously, Creative Carbon Scotland is doing some brilliant work in arts and festivals, and we really wanted to speak to you too and hear more about. So, for us to give a start, who wants to give us a little bit more about CCS and some of the key projects and roles that you have there?
Absolutely. So I can start with that if you like. So as you've kind of outlined, Sandro, with Creative Carbon Scotland, we work right at the intersection of culture and climate change. And we have two main strands. So one where we are enabling those within the cultural sector, by which we mean all the performing arts, as well as screen, creative industries, and other elements of almost anything that counts as culture. And we are about enabling them to address the climate emergency through the way that they behave, thinking about their own environmental impact and how we can take action there. And we also have another strand to our work, which we refer to as culture shift, that is more about experimenting with new models and ways of connecting artistic workers and creative workers with those in the environmental sector. So bringing the sort of unique power of the creative arts and the creative sector to the environmental issues and what we can all do about the global climate crisis. So that work looks a little bit different. So I will give you a couple of examples of our projects, if you like. So with the first example of the work, which we sometimes refer to as transformation of culture, where we're thinking about the way that culture can look at its own footprint and kind of walk the walk when it comes to climate. I work with a number of cultural organisations across Scotland to support them with their carbon management and emissions reporting. So where they're looking at their own footprint and the ways that they can address that through their carbon management planning. And on the other side, there's also we have this Climate Beacons project, which we launched sort of to line up with COP26, but it was really about a broader discussion that we were seeing COP26 as kind of a punctuation point almost of enabling kind of wider public engagement. And what Climate Beacons did was set up different partnerships around Scotland, bringing together cultural and environmental organisations with local communities to look at specific kind of climate action that can happen in their local area that's relevant to their own local environmental experiences. So that's been a really exciting project to kind of take part in and to be able to facilitate, because our role is more facilitative in that way, where we are looking at these more sort of locally specific areas and what they can bring to our wider experience and our wider expertise around the kind of cultural contribution to how we all work together to tackle the climate emergency. So that's kind of a couple of examples of our general framing, but now I'm going to hand over to Romane to tell us a little bit about what we do that's more sort of specific around the festivals, and maybe a bit around the Green Arts initiative as well.
Yeah. So essentially, my role is to facilitate the Green Arts Initiative, which is a network of about 350 cultural organizations across Scotland who are trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other part of my role is to support the festivals, the Edinburgh festivals, in their ambitious strategy to reach net zero by 2045. That involves a lot of this facilitation and projects, like pilot projects to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And as Caro said as well, she's doing carbon reporting. We're doing a lot of carbon reporting as well for the festivals specifically.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Obviously, it looks like your work is clearly aligned also with some of the government strategies regarding to climate change, and it's always good to see organizations having clear alignment with government strategies. I think, Cara, you mentioned COP26, and obviously COP26 was a big thing as a catalyst of lots of actions, catalyst of lots of activity, debates, discussions. And I'm sure you guys were involved with that, and we've seen things that you've done, and you mentioned that as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about your participation during COP, and what are the things that you've seen and noticed in terms of the event?
Yeah, absolutely. So with COP26, this was obviously the event was being hosted in Glasgow. The UK and Italy were co-hosting COP26 this year. The Conference of the Parties does, of course, happen every year. So but this was a particularly big one, which tends to happen every 5 years or so, where really key decisions are made around policy and targets that cascade out across the world and to all of the participating UN countries. So we were lucky enough to be granted observer status as an NGO, which meant that some of us could actually attend in person and see what was happening. So with COP26, things were divided up into the blue zone and the green zone. And the blue zone was sort of the official negotiating space where actors and policy makers from all around the world and observer NGOs were all there to sort of actually take the negotiations a step further, see how agreements could be made. And there were lots of fringe events as well that were connected with that. And the green zone of COP was more about the civil society aspect and kind of bringing what was coming out of the event into the more sort of public facing area. So I think within the sort of, as I mentioned before, our approach was very much to see COP26 as a bit of a kind of a punctuation mark, because as you mentioned, Sandro, it's obviously a big catalyst for change and a catalyst for people's awareness as well. So definitely observed a sort of higher level of awareness around climate change and people wanting to do more. So really I have found so far that our role has been to kind of facilitate that and to provide the support that people need to take their actions further. So obviously our focus is around the cultural sector, but we are seeing more and more interest in what we do and ways of using our resources and our thinking that we've been gathering for a decade now. So we're sort of really happy to be able to share that with a slightly wider audience. In terms of my own kind of experience of attending it, it was quite interesting. I was able to go into the blue zone. So I saw some of I managed to see Al Gore speak, which was quite exciting for me personally, as someone who became involved in the environmental movement. I've been involved since about, I would say 2005, 2006, so most of my working life. And it's been an interesting journey. And I remember seeing Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth right at the beginning, and then to see him speak live with updated facts and figures and statistics was just quite an experience. I also saw a really great event that involved Indigenous leaders engaging with the COP26 presidency, so directly with Alex Sharma. And it was an absolute privilege to hear those voices in that space. And I think really important as well, because as we really start thinking about how these policies and targets need to play out across the world, we need to remember that climate justice is a massive part of that, and understanding that currently those with the least resources to address climate change are the ones that are most affected. And a lot of that is represented with Indigenous communities' experiences so far of the climate emergency, and needing resources to support their own capacity to address that. And also the way that we sometimes, within the way that we think about carbon, when we're sort of looking at how we sort of share out our responsibility and share out what our emissions reductions look like, we need to ensure that we're not falling into the same trap of using the same mechanisms that have depleted the resources so drastically of so many countries around the world who are seen as sort of lesser developed. And so we need to make sure that climate justice is sewn into any solutions that we have, really. So that was something, a really strong thing that I felt with COP26 as a whole. The whole event is very spread out and doesn't necessarily feel super connected. So there's a huge array of things going on, and sometimes you feel like you're missing out because you weren't in something else. But I think that was a really unique opportunity to engage with those voices and to hear what's going on, because we don't get that opportunity the rest of the time.
It's interesting because obviously, like as you said, climate justice, just transition are actually very important aspects that we need to think about. That not only, and we always associate to countries and developing countries and things and geographical areas, but we also have the transition in sectors, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, like the transition from the car industry or the oil industry will be very different from the cultural industry or the education industry and things like that. During the COP26, have you seen other organizations? Have you had the chance to engage with other organizations that were connected to cultural industries or to events industry or so on? Have you had the chance to share, a word with them and have these similar views? Do you guys have similar views or not?
Yeah. It was good that COP26 actually gave us the opportunity to release a film that was in partnership with some other collaborators. So we had Historic Environment Scotland involved, and a number of other partners, the Scottish Government, and we brought together a film that was about the role of culture in climate action. So we were able to use COP26 as a space to launch that. It was also interesting. Myself, I saw the launch of the Sports for Climate Action framework. So sports and culture obviously sort of linked. And I'm sure, Sandro, you would be able to sort of think of that in your academic role as well. But there are similarities with the kind of potential for action. Both sectors have this kind of grassroots involvement where lots of people turn to the cultural sector for things that they do for fun, or things that they might do voluntarily. The same is true of sports. And equally, we have professional artists and orchestras, ensembles, large theatre companies travelling around globally to perform their work. And the same is true of sports, where you have the professional level. There's a lot of travel involved. There's a lot of kind of temporary events infrastructure as well. So it was quite interesting to see the way that the sports sector were addressing that kind of in quite a formal way of their action framework. I was very impressed by that. But in terms of a lot within the Blue Zone was more kind of on the policy side, I would say. So there was maybe, like I say, we were there with observer status, and it did feel like there was a lot to kind of watch and take in, rather than necessarily sort of fully be a full part of. But I'd be interested as well to give Romane had a slightly different experience of going to see a couple of other things. So yeah, would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I actually didn't have the chance to access the Blue Zones. I had a bit of a different experience, not seeing much of the political aspect. But the Green Zone, I only spent maybe half a day there, and I found it a bit of a display of initiatives here and there, kind of a trade fair vibe, but didn't get that much out of it. There were other events outside as well, which in Glasgow and actually elsewhere in Scotland as well, in the cultural sector that I really enjoyed. And I think I was actually really surprised to see so many cultural events around climate change during COP. I think that's showing how the arts can play a role as well. And, it's this very powerful aspect of the art that can really create emotions and, tied to complex situations such as climate change to make you think and reflect and feel. So it was good to see that. And I think the movie you mentioned, Caro, called Climate Action Needs Culture. Yes, that's right. Is a very good representation of the role of culture. It really encapsulates, I think, those key messages of what culture can provide in, the route towards net zero in 2045. I think really the key messages were that the cultural sector needs to bring about a collective response within the cultural sector and also across with other sectors, and to really build a legacy of action beyond COP26. And it doesn't stop there. What do we do after? And that will require a lot of leadership as well to make this internal and collective transformations.
This is interesting. Like I wasn't there at the COP, the main COP, but I've been to some of the fringe events, and there was, events organized by Visit Scotland, events organized by Event Scotland. It was like, as you said, individual groups and arts groups doing manifestations and performances around the city as well. I took my students to walk around the city, and it was fascinating. And then you may not know, and or you may not see. Did Creative Scotland organize anything? I didn't see, but as a fringe event of.
As far as I'm aware, we were involved. Creative Scotland were involved in the launch of
Climate Action Needs Culture.
Climate Action Needs Culture.
Oh, okay.
Every time I say it, I get it the other way around. Culture needs climate action. They both need each other.
Yeah.
is the sort of spoiler
That's
punchline there. But I think, as far as I'm aware, that was the main thing. I know that at the moment, Creative Scotland are also looking at their own internal policies around the climate emergency, and I think that's where it comes into play, that COP26 is kind of it has to be seen as a punctuation mark, and sort of that it's part of the process overall. And of course, Creative Scotland would have supported a lot of the events that were happening, through the cultural organisations.
Yeah, because it is like that. It is, we've seen, and again, we're going back to the idea of strategies and targets of being carbon is neutral by 2045 and all these things, but it's like, what are the key actions that organizations, both private or public, are actually doing to get there? And I think that is a little bit of that reporting systems. In terms of the creative sector in Scotland specifically, and obviously you both are very well connected to that, how are they adjusting to try to get there in 2024 and 2045? What are the key actions that artists, venues, private organizations, public body, what are the key actions that you see them doing to get to, because I think there's a lot about that. A lot of people, there was a lot of complaining, you have all these targets, but without the actions, those targets will never be reached. And I'm wondering if, what can you share in terms of the observations, in terms of the creative sector in Scotland and the actions that has been taken to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I could maybe begin that with my experience of supporting the cultural organisations that are reporting to their funders, including Creative Scotland, around their climate targets. So for the last 5 years, they've been reporting on their emissions from energy, travel and waste. And something that we've learned over the past 5 years is that, encouragingly, the footprint has come down. So we've seen a reduction of, it's about 40%, nearly 50% in terms of the emissions that people have reported on. We've seen this reduction. We know from that data that overall, the organizations, energy and utilities make up the majority of the footprint, but energy and utilities have been gradually decreasing in a very encouraging way, whereas travel has been more problematic. It only represents about 20 to 30% of the footprint, but it's kind of sat there just staying still. And a lot of it is from flights, which we know is related to kind of international collaborations, which are really important for cultural organizations to do their work well and to do their work effectively and in an engaging way. And also waste, while it's very visible to us individually and often to audiences, and often there's a lot of capacity to reduce waste and to work in creative ways, for example, through circular economy strategies, it only represents a small portion of the carbon footprint, which is quite interesting. And that's where we can see that carbon is not quite the full picture of our social response and our cultural response to climate change. But in terms of the actions that organizations have taken, they're really varied because the organizations are really varied. No two organizations are the same. Some of the organizations that I work with directly have a footprint of maybe 1 ton of carbon a year, which is like 10% of an individual person's sort of emissions. And then there are some with, 600, 700 tons because they have multiple physical buildings, for example. So these would all be, and they're all taking action in some way, shape or form. So these larger organizations, where there are venues involved, their largest challenges tend to be around energy and utilities. And a lot of them have been able to take action through doing things like changing lighting systems, changing heating and ventilation systems so they're more efficient. So moving to LED lighting, for example. And we've seen reductions in their electricity, not only their consumption, but also their emissions as a result of that. The more challenging area does tend to be travel, but some organizations have made some really interesting and innovative changes to their touring models, for example, to try and ensure that they're taking the lowest carbon routes, that they are continuing international collaborations where they're doing as much of that as they can online. So, for example, prior to a sort of physical event happening or a physical performance or such, then looking at how do we have those sort of early meetings and interactions? Can they happen online? And it's something that, as much as the pandemic has been a very hard time for a lot of the cultural sector and very challenging, it's also in some ways given some opportunity to explore those different ways of continuing international collaboration, continuing a kind of positive global outlook for culture as a whole. And it's been, there's been a lot of organizations that have learned a lot from that, and are starting to see ways that they can create policies and procedures that will enable them to minimize the emissions from their work. Because the other thing that we find within the cultural sector is carbon management as a sort of practice and as a methodology tends to be more fitted to industrial settings, for example, or models of using resources to create things that are then sold and distributed and transported around the world, which in some cases the cultural model matches that, but in a lot of cases the cultural business models are completely different to that. So it's looking at an organization where they might go to depending on their collaborators or their programs, their emissions will be very different year on year. So we can't apply the same logic of seeing year on year reductions. It just doesn't quite fit the cultural model. So part of our role is to help cultural organizations understand how they can minimize their emissions while still producing this high quality work.
Now, a lot of the work in cultural is done between different organizations.
Yeah.
Right? So let's say an artist will rent a venue, and the artist may be very aware of his or her carbon footprint.
Yeah.
But then while playing in a maybe not very environmental friendly venue, how does that relationship between those organizations happen? Those type of conversations happen. Do this? Is there kind of a behind the scene activism, let's say, where people say, well, my event or my festival won't happen in that place unless they really tackle some of the environmental issues they have?
Yeah, there's a very, I think I'm going to let Romane come in there and respond to that, actually, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and that we need to have those conversations in between artists, venues, festivals, etc., because they don't necessarily have control on everything. The festivals in Edinburgh don't necessarily have control on all the venues. It depends, but so having this conversation is really the first step, I think, and maybe playing more role of influencing or trying to see how we can support each other, so we make sure that it will be helpful for the venues as well, to work on reducing their carbon emissions. So trying to support each other so that it benefits both sides as well.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that the way that the audience plays into that as well. So, of course, if you have a festival and nobody comes, then that's not generally considered a success. So how do we kind of bring in the idea that, so was some research quite a while back now that showed that the majority of, if you included the audience travel emissions for a music festival, for example, those travel emissions would generally be larger than the emissions from putting on a 3-4 day event. When it comes to energy and utilities, especially as our energy sources are becoming greener and our sort of transport infrastructure has a while to catch up yet. So we have to kind of think about that kind of balance of responsibility as well, and how cultural organisations can use, as Romane mentions, the more sort of influencing angle of how we communicate to our audiences, how we can kind of enable positive action when it comes to audience travel choices, audience sort of wider behaviours as well. If there's ways that we can change the way people think through the art that we create.
Influence that decision making as well, and the process of the thinking. I remember we took students years ago to we organized a student conference in Edinburgh, and we had someone from the Edinburgh Book Festival coming to talk exactly about some of the changes they made in the festival in order to become more environmental friendly. And it was things like, instead of giving bottles of water, we create a system with pipes where people can refill their bottles, or you mentioned ventilation systems and how we develop technology with the tents that we develop in order to reduce the amount of heating we need to put in, or improve the ventilation without electricity or something like that. And it was fascinating because obviously there is the natural almost technological development when you're talking about festivals and events that happen. There is also the continuous change in the profile of the attendees. So as we see more and more engagement of young people with environmental narratives and discourse, then we may see different demands from the consumer, and then we also going to see a new generation of event managers, festivals organizers that will come already with different perspectives. No, it's fascinating. Now you mentioned something about carbon management. I think is more your area, Caro, if I'm not wrong. Can you just explain a little bit more? What does that involve? You talked about energy, but for people who are not really from the field, how would you explain this analysis of carbon management and so on?
Yeah, on a basic level, it's a way of understanding and reducing the environmental impact. And when I say environmental impact, I mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and the sort of negative side, really, of what we do. So the emissions that are associated with energy use, with the travel choices that are made, and with the waste side of things. There's also an aspect that could be linked with materials. For example, if you choose different material sources, then the carbon emissions within a certain supply chain might be different depending on where the thing comes from or what it's made from and the processes that went into producing the thing. But those emissions are slightly harder to understand, and because supply chains change so much, we haven't really included them so much within the formal carbon reporting that organisations do at the moment. And that's because actually, when it comes to the sort of legal side and their obligations as organizations, a lot of cultural organizations are not of the scale where they would be legally required to report. So this is more innovation on the part of the cultural organizations involved and their funders. So it's a good thing that people are doing carbon management within culture, and we should be doing it, but it's also something where we can still have a little scope for learning. But I would say the two main things that happen when it comes to carbon management are firstly understanding. So understanding the carbon footprint, how many of your emissions are from energy and utilities, how many from travel, and what that means in terms of the proportion, and in terms of, importantly, your capacity to act on those emissions and reduce them. And so the second part of that is reducing your emissions and understanding how that can look over time. And we're now at a point, I would say, where a lot of organizations have done what you might refer to as the low-hanging fruit. So the sort of, changing your light bulbs to more efficient models, maybe encouraging staff to take public transport to work, these kind of things. Most organizations have done that. So now we're starting to think about, there are sometimes entire business models that need to be questioned or addressed or changed ultimately. So, like we said, the sort of major discussion around international travel is part of it. So that sort of physical travel having that carbon impact as well.
Is that something that, like, obviously Creative Carbon offers support to organizations on that side? What type of support do they have? Do they, I guess one question that you may always get is about, I would love to do that, I don't have the money. How those financial things are solved? Do the government provide support, or what are the other ways that people can, for example, finance some of the changes related to that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's not necessarily one that I have an immediate answer for, but we have a lot of tools and resources that very much help organizations with that understanding of the impact. As I mentioned before, there's a huge range of organizations that we work with. So the diversity that we work with, there's no way that I could be an expert in how to run a theatre environmentally and also how to run a community arts charity environment. So our approach is generally facilitative and platforming the good practice that we know is already out there because we've seen it. So we know that there are organizations that are really leading the way in this. So we have a whole suite of case studies. Romane spoke earlier about the way that the Green Arts Initiative is run through kind of connecting green champions who tend to be volunteers within organizations who take responsibility for that carbon reporting and that understanding. So connecting those people to really sort of bring the practice together. There's also, yes, when it comes to the funding side, we tend to direct people towards Zero Waste Scotland or the Energy Saving Trust. So Zero Waste Scotland do provide interest-free loans, for example, that can help to finance energy efficiency, and Energy Saving Trust can provide some support as well, and at least kind of signposting people in the right direction when it comes to funding. But it's a big challenge, and part of it is from the diversity of requirements, because we have every sort of requirement from some organizations, maybe, museums and art galleries. Traditionally, their big challenges are around being in listed buildings where it's very hard to make changes to the building infrastructure so that they can reduce the energy consumption of the building. Whereas other organizations, if they're touring theatre companies or something, it's more around how can they finance what we might refer to as slow travel. So travel that isn't taken by planes tends to be more expensive, but we don't currently have a funding mechanism to support alternatives. So how do we sort of unpick that as a sector? And we're still at the early stages of what that would be like. So I would say the main types of support we offer are in that sort of facilitating and strengthening networks so that we can identify the issues, and also in sort of signposting to funding bodies that might be able to help.
Sometimes sharing good practice can solve so many issues as well and can help you so much, is it not? Romane, I think Caro mentioned the Green Arts Initiative. would you like to? Is that something that you are involved on your side of the work, and would you like to tell us maybe about some of the developments, some of the ideas that we have on that scheme?
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do at the moment is really trying to scale up this initiative. So we make sure that all these organizations that are part of the network start working on reducing their greenhouse gases emissions. So it's a lot about, again, facilitating, trying to connect people together. If they're working on a specific project to reduce their greenhouse gases emissions, and another organization in Scotland might be interested in this, trying to see how synergies can be created, so we can move faster. So that's the project. And maybe something also about the festivals, on going back on your question on carbon management, but because this is something also I kind of do as well, similar to what Caro does with the carbon management. So the festivals will report their environmental emissions at the end of each year, and then I analyze that and come back with feedbacks based on their reports. And the report is improving every year. So, for instance, there were working from home emissions that now we're taking into consideration, and this is becoming even more complex because you have hybrid systems now where people work half days, and it's not very clear, etc. So we have to think through all those things to improve our carbon emissions and make it as accurate as possible, so we can then take the right decisions to reduce the carbon emissions of the festivals or other organizations. And the festivals have been working as well with an external audit with a sustainability consultancy, which I think is really good, just to check as well as someone which is not part of the organization, to make sure that we do the reporting correctly, and then review as well the calculation and methodology over the years. So this will be done again in 2025 and in 2030, sorry, to ensure that carbon savings are made.
I think that's a very interesting point that I haven't thought of that about before. You said about the changes in terms of hybrid working and home working and things like that, and the pros and cons environmentally of all those things. So it's fascinating point. I'm pretty sure it kind of changed a little bit the way of analyzing the impact. Now, the final part of this conversation, I want to look a little bit to the future of arts, festivals, culture in terms of environmental impacts. We've seen some significant progress in the last years. We kind of know more and more about what are the areas that we should tackle, and I think you mentioned energy and you mentioned transport and things like that. But what do you see as next steps for to take the sector to carbon neutral, environmental friendly route or roads?
Do you want me to go first, Caro? I think I see it as really twofold. There's a practical side to it, and there's also more of a vision or approach that needs to be taken to reach carbon net zero by 2045 for Scotland. The practical side is, again, really about reporting your emissions and taking action on that. And then the vision is more about this collaborative approach and this need for leadership. And I want to emphasize again something that Caro mentioned at the beginning, that it needs to be done as well in a fair and equal way. So it's often called climate justice or just transition, but at CCS we call it equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. And so we've seen a few pledges. Music declared emergency, for instance, or and pledges are good. I think it really sets the tone. It really gives direction, but we need more accountability and action. And that starts, I think, with reporting your emissions, your carbon emissions, and environmental impacts. And this is really your baseline. It helps you set a plan, a strategy to then reduce your emissions. efficiently. So the first step, if you haven't started it yet, report your carbon emissions. And it's likely that you can't report on all aspects of your emissions as you start, but it's important to get going and then improve your reporting each year. And second step I see as, well, based on these figures on your reporting emissions, make decisions then to reduce your environmental footprints. And another thing is to make a plan on the longer term as well, so you're able to reach targets. Now, the vision side, I think the industry needs to think more collectively, especially when you think about how do we get to net zero? Like, how do we get there together? And what does it really mean, net zero? It's hard to really reach net zero. Does it include carbon offsetting, and how much? So I think this really needs more collective thinking to see how we get there together. And I think Festivals Edinburgh is a beautiful example of that kind of collaboration in this sector. There were 11 festivals working together on sustainability issues, and that require a lot of effort. But through this collaborative effort, you're learning from each other. You're really pushing, to achieve more and to maximize your impacts, to work towards national targets. So more collaboration, I think, is also one of the steps. And back again to leadership, that's essential. The Scottish government has their net zero target, and there will be regulations coming in. So it's about being ahead of the curve and take the opportunity to be leaders in the cultural sector.
That's an interesting point. It's like because you said though, they need to do the reports, and so am I right to understand that there is still not regulations enforcing some sectors to report on their carbon footprint or carbon management? Is that right?
It depends on the scale of the organization. So some will come under, there's a energy reporting requirement called SCCR, which is around carbon reduction, and that requires organizations of a certain size to report. But a lot of cultural organizations are not of that size. And so the main sort of levers for carbon reporting in our sector tend to come from funders, or from collaborative groups. So, for example, the Festivals Edinburgh umbrella supporting the festivals to report becomes, and that's where Romane's role comes in, is sort of facilitating that exchange and those commitments that can be made. But the reality is that at the moment we don't have a lot of kind of regulatory levers beyond but of course the requirements of the funders are a part of that. So the organisations I work with are directly funded by Creative Scotland, have that requirement because Creative Scotland agree with us that the climate emergency should be a priority and that organisations should be reporting on their emissions. So organisations that are regularly funded have to report on their emissions. And
do you think that will change? Do you think that will change, Carol? Do you think that it will become something?
I think though it's likely, as I think you pointed out, COP26 has obviously been a bit of a catalyst, and I think Creative Scotland will potentially ahead when it comes to funders requiring, although Arts Council England also do this, so requiring their regularly funded organisations to report. But I think we can expect other funders to be on board with that, and we can expect more responsibility to kind of be spread out. I think that's something I sort of wanted to bring to this conversation as well, that there's this idea, that we all need to take responsibility for the climate emergency and we all need to do our bit. And I suppose that's true to a point, but we need to remember that bit is not necessarily individual, and we need to remain collaborative and collective in our approach because it's a collective problem. But we do need to fix it. So I think there's a way to kind of encourage more collaboration, and not necessarily always having, having your accounts in order and having your emissions reporting done is good. But there's something else that needs to come from the sort of influencing side, how we think about those other things that Romane mentioned as well, around this kind of engagement and advocacy that comes out when we think about how we work together to achieve these things.
That's great. Romane said give obviously some very interesting tips already there for the sector. Now, UWS as a educational institution and helping to develop future event managers, future cultural leaders, and so on. I wanted from you some tips, because one of the things that for me always claims when you talk about environment and arts and culture and sport is the interdisciplinarity of the debates, and one of the issues that we as an education institution have is how can we fit so many different important things within a curriculum, and that's why we, in many cases we develop systems that will lead students to or encourage students to learn or engage with other learning activities out with their curriculum as well. But what would be your tips for students who will come into the arts, festivals sector, cultural sector in the future, and what are the ways for them to better engage with environmental knowledge, wanting or not environmental policy, and the transformation that we see in the sector just now?
Romane, do you want to go first?
Well, maybe starting with a very simple thing, just when you're probably going to events and festivals, so like look at what those events and festivals are doing and value those that are making real efforts for the environment, and be critical, of course. I'm not talking about greenwashing there, like really what are they doing that will have an impact, and choose your events and festivals like that as well, and think about how you're going there, the food you're having there, all the things that your own choices as well can reduce the impact of those events. So don't forget that you have power as students, visitors of events, and take that into consideration. So that's maybe one little tip. And then to get into the sector, I'd say just contact people, and if you're interested and want to reduce the carbon impact of an event you like, or bring your ideas. I think we need as well this influence from outside, from the visitors. I think it's really helpful for the sector to move forward.
Yeah, and I think, I would kind of add to that, as if you're an emerging producer, emerging events manager that's getting into the sector, is know your stuff. So do your research and find out about, do your calculations, find out what the lowest carbon way of providing power for your event is, and making sure that you're equipped with that knowledge when you go into that role. So I've done what I can around that, and I've done what I can around that. So that's sort of knowing what you're doing, keeping up to date with what's going on. And I would suggest engaging with Creative Carbon Scotland. We do have a regular newsletter that goes out once a month that tells people about opportunities in the green arts, and the sort of and obviously signposts our tools and resources that are available for this sort of work. And then thirdly, collaboration. It would be my sort of number one top tip for that's almost anything across the arts and across sustainability. So I think culture is kind of unique in many sectors in that we really, collaboration is absolutely essential to what we do. And that's true of the climate crisis as well. Like we need to work together on this as well. So if you're managing a festival, or you've got an idea for a festival you want to put on, think about who your collaborators are, and find out about the local community. Where are you working? Who are the community partners? Who are in the same way that you would think about the local community groups that you might work with and you might reach with your impact. Think about if any of those are sustainability related, and how you can kind of try out new things as well, because festivals so often give us that opportunity to really give us a one-off experience of what a world can be like. And that's kind of one of the great things about festivals is you've got this sort of temporary, a week or 2 weeks where everything is how it could be rather than how it is day to day. And that's that's a really brilliant thing to be able to do. So yeah, you have real power if you're going in as an events manager or a festivals producer, and it can be really helpful. We also have a initiative I wanted to mention that is called Culture for Climate. That was kind of a pilot project that we did earlier this year, thinking about bringing together cultural practitioners and artists to think about what culture can do, and those steps are quite nicely encapsulate a lot of the things that we've talked about today. So we have the 10 steps towards a just and green recovery for culture that were developed by those who are involved in the cultural sector with our sort of facilitative support. So it might be worth having a look at those as well.
And that's the thing, I think the more informed you are, the more, like, as you said, the information is there. You don't need to be a specialist in insulation, but you can actually, understand in many senses what are the ways of being more sustainable in terms of energy and so on. And then develop those partnerships, develop those relationships with other sectors and people from other fields as well to be able to achieve the goals that you have. So you mentioned the site, so creativecarbon.com, is that right?
creativecarbonscotland.com. Yes.
Creativecarbonscotland.com. Well done. And we'll encourage everyone to go and access and have a look in the content that you have there. And for those who are already involved in the creative sector, culture, arts, festivals, if you haven't engaged with Creative Carbon Scotland, here's your opening, and both Caro and Romane would be very keen to engage with you all.
Exactly. Yeah, very happy to.
I would like to say a big thank you to you both for your time just before Christmas. And I know you're both very, very busy. So the CCSE, just want to say, as a member of the CCSE, I want to say thank you for your time today. And I'm sure that would be extremely valuable for our students, our partners, and the people watching this conversation. Yeah. So thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you. Bye.
Cool.